So I don't know about you, but I'm about ready to get this excited and get this party started and jump right in. I'm going to turn it over to Shiva Rajbhandari, who is a student activist, mover and shaker from Boise, Idaho, who has come today to share his story about mobilizing student-driven climate action, and will be introducing our keynote speaker. So please help me in welcoming Shiva.
Thank you so much, Kat. And I think there was one name that was missing on the thank you list earlier. Can we all give a big thank you to Kat for making this all happen? I know Kat from working at Boise State, where she's originally from, and so pretty cool person. Yeah, my name's Shiva. I'm a senior at Boise High in Idaho, and I just asked to kind of share a little bit of my story working in a totally different space for a lot of the similar goals that y'all kind of have outlined here. I was super lucky to receive a climate education because in Idaho it's not part of our state K-12 science standards, and it's really kind of this political football, if you can believe that. But I was lucky to grow up in a district where climate change was taught, and it was taught in our earth science in 7th grade in about a 2-week unit where we talk really about what the greenhouse effect is, why climate change is killing the polar bears, and how bad it is for people in the Amazon. And I remember, just with that sense, realizing how big of a crisis this was. Not really fully connecting it to kind of literally the smoke that was outside that was canceling our cross-country practice at the time, but still recognizing wow, this is a really big issue. And I remember thinking about my family in Nepal, where my dad's from, where my grandma had just died of lung cancer, and realizing, hey, fossil fuels are responsible for my grandma's death. But not only that, but those receding Himalayan glaciers are inducing a water crisis there that's just so severe, it's destabilizing the entire subcontinent. And so I think a lot of all y'all can kind of relate, I turned inward and started doing all the things that corporations tell us we need to do to stop climate change. I started recycling. I started taking cold showers. Holy moly, those suck. I stopped eating meat. Started punishing myself for driving. It was crazy. And for about a year, I did all these things that my mom's work, which was HP Hewlett Packard, said we needed to do. And then I looked outside and nothing had changed. And we still had a climate crisis. It was still we just set a heat record. And I was oh, we got to do more than this. And so I started organizing with my peers, just like y'all. And I got my friends together, and we were well, where can we bring about climate action and system change in our community that is going to address the actual needs of Idahoans? Not people in the Amazon, not the freaking polar bears, Idahoans who are facing the first and foremost effects of climate change right here in our community. Boise is the 13th fastest warming city in the country. We have smoke. It's the only place in the country, Idaho is one of the only states, where air has gotten worse since the passage of the Clean Air Act. And so we have a lot of work that we can do, and our city's been a really big leader. But then we turn to our schools, which are the second largest organization by footprint in our state, the Boise School District. And we were okay, our schools need a plan. Portland's doing it, Boulder's doing it. All across the country, we're seeing this happen. We need a clean energy commitment and long-term sustainability plan for our schools. And so we started organizing. We got students from every school together in a group called the Idaho Climate Justice League, and we started strategizing. We sent emails to our board members, asking for meetings. We wrote over 300 postcards. We delivered the largest petition our school district had ever received, and we kept asking for meetings with the board, and it seemed like we were second-hand stakeholders. Our voices didn't really matter. And we'd get emails back, thank you for reaching out. We are committed to sustainability and everything we do, and we appreciate your time, thank you. It was never let's do something with this. And so that's when we kind of turned to the streets, and we said, okay, if our board isn't going to listen to us, we're going to demand that action take place. And we started organizing climate strikes. We started writing op-eds. We started calling out these elected officials who are supposed to represent students. Students are the primary stakeholders in in our schools, we're the primary beneficiaries of schools. We deserve to have our voices heard. We deserve to be involved in the decision-making process in our school district. And finally, after like 3 front-page articles, our board was pressured into passing this watered-down commitment called the Collective Commitment on Clean Energy, which was kind of an affirmation as to like, we're gonna think more about sustainability. And I was like, okay, well, that's some BS. Like, we want to see more of that. We want to see real commitments. We want to see a long-term plan for our schools. And so I started looking into what it would take to be on the school board. And, I found out you have to be 18, and there's an election every 2 years for these 6-year terms. But a ton of our board members had just quit because of just different things. And so there was a 2-year seat that was open on the board, and the election was September 6th. And I turned 18 August 30th. Where all my Virgos at? No, like you? And so I was like, okay, well, I'm going to run for the school board, and I'm going to run on a platform of climate justice and mental health for our school district. And so over the last summer, I brought my friends together and we started like strategizing. We started knocking on doors. We sent out like letters to we just wrote down a list like 200 of our like closest friends, and we sent them all letters asking for like $5, $10, $1,500 donations. And within about a month, we'd raised $10,000 for my campaign for the school board. And we really made waves across our community, talking about what it means to have the folks who are actually in our schools, the folks who are actually experiencing our education system at the decision-making table, and how powerful it can be when we uplift these voices and elevate folks to the decision-making process. And it was a hard campaign. I remember my opponent was like this 40-year-old dude. He'd been endorsed by these like far-right organizations, and he had, there was just like a lot going on. And it was scary too. Like Idaho, I think many of you are probably familiar with, a lot of the far-right extremism that we see, where we have, folks parading with guns outside of our school, and people trying to ban books and trying to ban masks, and people getting hauled out of the Capitol in wheelchairs because they like broke all the windows and stuff. We had our own January 6th. But at the end of the day, with the money that we raised, we were able to hire and pay 15 door knockers who are all students in our school district, and we were able to reach out to thousands of folks across the district, and ultimately, come September 6th, over 20,000 people turned out to vote in the largest turnout school board race in our state's history. And I was elected to the school board. And since then, I've really just been working for climate justice, and it's been freaking painful, because it turns out when you have 7 members on a board and just one of them is like, we need climate action, things change very slowly. But I'm so excited about all the work that y'all are doing, and that's why I was so excited when Kat invited me to come out to Portland, because every single thing that y'all do here, we see in Portland, in Boise, and we see across the country, and it inspires us and moves us all forward. And so I just wanted to really say thank you to all the student activists out there. Thank you to your own school board candidate, Danny Cage, for really leading the way on climate justice. And I'm just super honored to be here and to just be in this community with y'all and think about, I think one of the things that we kind of get bogged down about in Idaho is the inability to dream. The inability to think outside the box because, our schools don't have enough funding. And because, 35% of us are fascists. And when I come to events like this, it really allows me to dream. It allows my friends and I to dream in our schemes and think bigger about what kind of system change we want to achieve in the world. And so it's just super cool to be here. I'm really honored to introduce our keynote speaker. This is like, woo, really cool. Her name, if you haven't heard by now, is Favianna Rodriguez. She is incredible. She's sitting right here, and I cannot even believe it. All the way from Oakland, California. She's an interdisciplinary artist, cultural strategist, and entrepreneur. And her art and praxis, y'all know what praxis is? I think that's such a cool word you wrote in the script. It's like the combination of activism and like thinking, right? It's like, yeah, did I get that? That's a cool word, praxis. Her art and praxis address migration, gender justice, climate change, racial equity, and pleasure activism. Her work centers joy and healing while challenging entrenched myths and dominant cultural practices. Her signature mark making embodies the perspective of a first-generation American Latina artist with Afro-Latina roots who grew up in Oakland, California during the era of the war on drugs and the birth of hip-hop. A strategy advisor to artists of all genres, Favianna is regarded as one of the leading thinkers and personalities uniting art, culture, and social impact, and she's been instrumental in building a cultural strategy ecosystem that supports BIPOC artists in the US, including being the president and co-founder of the Center for Cultural Power, and having helped launch the Constellations Culture Change Fund. Favianna is recognized as a climate justice leader across America, and she brings her personal journey to climate justice fight through her writing, including as a contributing writer to the best-selling anthology, All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis, edited by Ayanna Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson. You can read more about Favianna in the event guide. She has these incredible awards, she's all around such a cool person. And this is just like the honor of my life to introduce Favianna Rodriguez. Please welcome her to the stage. Thank you, Favianna.
Okay, hey everyone, I am so excited to be here joining you from Ohlone territory, also known as Oakland, California. And I'm just, really aligned with being here. Already some of the stuff I heard is very aligned with some of the work I do. And I'm going to talk to you today about the power of art and culture in our climate movements, and really the power of storytelling. Because, a lot of times we think that if we change laws, if we change policies, we're going to win this climate fight. But in reality, we also have to change hearts and minds. And I'm going to talk to you about how it is that we're going to do that. So the first thing is that the thing that I talk about a lot is that culture is power, right? We know that there's earth power, there's money power, there's political power, but there's also cultural power. And that is that culture is what surrounds us all the time. It's what we see, what we listen to on television, how we dress. It really makes us. And we have to leverage the power of culture in order to change the world. Now, in the climate movement, we know there's a lot of data, right? There's a lot of science. And yet, that's not moving people. What we need is artists, musicians, DJs, dancers, performers, cooks, to also be involved in this climate movement. Because it's the arts that moves our hearts and moves our emotions in order to understand why it is that this is happening. And I really love that the way that Hannah opened this up is talking about Native people and the core story that our society exists under. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. So, in culture, what is culture made up of, right? As human beings, we've been gathering around the fire and drawing on caves since the beginning of time. We've been singing songs. Culture is what defines us, right? And there are ideas or beliefs that then shape societies. And there's one big thing that we have to talk about when we talk about the story of this land that we're on, of this hemisphere, and that is that what happened here, right? Stolen land and stolen bodies. And this is important because this is actually a core story of why we are here today. And there are forces in this country who are trying to stop the teaching of this story, right? They're trying to stop critical race theory. But in reality, we know that over 500 years ago, there was an invasion, there was colonization that happened here, and that is what began the climate crisis. We can't just talk about the climate crisis about melting glaciers and polar bears. We have to start with the core idea, which is the idea of colonization. The idea of colonization that still exists today, y'all, because you know what? there was an idea that was a global idea that said that certain bodies could be exploited for the consolidation of wealth and power. And those bodies were human bodies, they were animal bodies, and they were land bodies, ocean bodies, forest bodies. And that continues today, right? There were certain bodies that got exploited. There was mass genocide committed on this land, over 95%. So when we talk about why we have a climate crisis, there was a huge destruction, devastation, rape, pillaging, murder of the original people of this land. And that began the destruction of ecosystems, right? And then there was stolen bodies from Africa, stolen labor, stolen wealth. And that is the basis of our systems today, right? Because when you look at where is pollution happening, where are oil doesn't extract itself. You need human beings. You need to actually put those extraction sites in places. And where do they go? They go in communities of color. They go on Indian land. And it's no secret that those who are dying, those who are most impacted by the climate crisis, are people of color. In fact, I know we call it the climate crisis, but in reality what it is, it's that there are bodies that are being exploited and violated, right? And those bodies are human beings. They're black, brown, poor, queer, trans bodies, disabled bodies. They are also living bodies like the ocean, like the forests that are being pillaged. And so what we fundamentally have to stop is we have to stop the worldview that allows for these bodies to be exploited, right? Because if we were to say, you know what, we believe that all human beings should be able to thrive in harmony with nature, and you can't go and pollute Oakland, my neighborhood, which is polluted, because there are human beings there and we have to protect human beings. So when we talk about the climate crisis, let's remember we have to talk about the core story of how we got here. And a lot of times in our climate movements, for many years, we didn't talk about that, right? Y'all have probably seen the documentary by Al Gore, An Inconvenient Truth. There's an inconvenient truth that people don't talk about. They don't talk about white supremacy, colonization, and how it got us here. We would not have the climate crisis if it were not for white supremacy and colonization. So I'm so glad that you all are talking about that, because the world is talking about that. I was at the UN Climate Summit, and there's indigenous people from all over the world who are saying colonization caused the climate crisis. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I grew up. I grew up in Oakland, California, East Oakland, during the era of the war on drugs. That's when our government was putting drugs in communities of color, and then they were locking people up for selling marijuana, right? I was growing up during that time. My community was one of the most dangerous communities in the country. It was a place nobody wanted to go to. And it was also a very polluted place. And I would always wonder, like, wow, why do so many of my friends have asthma? Well, the reason was because in my hood, in my neighborhood, there's two freeways. There's one that's the 880 and there's one that's the 580. The one that runs through the white neighborhoods, they said, we don't want trucks going through our neighborhood. So they prohibited trucks, which means that the freeway in my neighborhood has double the emissions. And it's why people in my neighborhood live 10 years less than people just 2 miles up. That's environmental racism, and that happened in 1970, even before I was born, right? I do not consent to emissions going through my neighborhood while affluent neighborhoods don't have to deal with that. But this is what I grew up with, and it's why I became an activist, because I realized early on that despite all the hardship that was happening, there was also power in art and culture. I would watch hip hop, I would see breakdancers and graffiti. The Black Panthers, who are from Oakland, California, I would still see Black power in the streets. And I realized that music and art and poetry, they help us see a way forward. Because art helps us imagine something that isn't here yet, right? It helps us feel what's possible. And it literally speaks to our emotions, and as human beings, we are emotional creatures. We are moved by our hearts more than we are by our minds. So that's when I decided to really use the power of art and culture to transform my community, right? Because the other thing that was happening is that I was like, wow, you know, I'm a kid who's growing up in an Afro-Latino family, and I would turn on Spanish TV and there was no black people. And I would turn on English TV and there was no Latinos, right? And so I always felt invisible. And this is the thing, is that our culture invisibilizes a lot of people. And it's part of the reason why we have such messed up laws, right? Is because we are not humanizing people. We're not humanizing immigrants. We're not humanizing Muslims or disabled people. And so we wonder, why are people so hateful? Is because our stories aren't out there. Because when our stories do get out there, things begin to change. So this is my neighborhood right here, Oakland. You can see it's red. In our state, we have something called the Cal Enviro screen, which allows you to type in your zip code and see how much pollution there is. I don't know if you guys have that here in Oregon, but it's a very useful tool. Because when you type in Beverly Hills, California, there's no red. It's all green. And this is Boyle Heights. Pollution is actually rampant. There is an invisible force that is destroying black and brown communities, and it's pollution. And so part of the things that I always think about as a climate activist is, how do we show what's happening? How do we get people to understand the inequities that are happening? So let's go back to talking about culture. Why is culture powerful? Because culture shapes worldview, okay? How we see the world, how we see gender, how we see race, how we see each other, how we relate to the natural world is all shaped by culture, right? And so I want you to think about even, how fast culture can change. How many of you, when you guys, maybe 10 years ago, when you were just growing up and you were in elementary school, how many of you all used pronouns, or you had the pronoun practice in your classroom? No, right? It didn't exist. I mean, when I was in high school, we barely were having GSAs, gay straight alliances, right? Okay, so it's been about 10 years, right, since the first black trans actress was on TV. Laverne Cox, Orange is the New Black, in 2013. Since then, what has happened? Janet Mock came out with her book, Pose came out. You have all kinds of trans people on TV, writing books, being visible, right? And you have the normalization of rejecting the binary by using things like pronouns and by embracing a more expansive language. That is culture change, right? And what's happening? What's happening in our country is that in the political sector, there is a backlash to it. And you know why? Because culture is really powerful. Because for the first time last year, there was a record-breaking number of teenagers that identified as non-binary. That is a threat. That is a threat to dominant culture. And it happens because our stories are out there, because people become unapologetic about expressing who they are. Same thing happened with Me Too. I grew up in a world where sexual harassment was the norm, but in 2018, people started coming out with their stories and culture changed. Okay, so politics maybe has not changed, but culture has changed. And we need to understand that culture moves very, very fast. And we have to organize in culture. Because a lot of times, you all probably grew up, people were like, oh yeah, art is cool, art is nice. No, art is not nice, art is a necessity. We absolutely need stories that are going to help people think different, right? We have to inspire them. We have to, thank you, we have to show what's possible. And a lot of times, in our movements, I've been a movement organizer since I was 15. I walked out my high school against, jails, what we were fighting for back then, because California used to lock a lot of people up. And talk about culture change. Now we're letting people free, because people are saying jails are not okay. Mass incarceration is not okay. But when I was growing up, people were like, okay, we got to go, hit up the school board person. We got to go, hit up our congressperson. And yes, of course, we need to hit the streets. We need to do occupations. We need to do that. And we need to change culture, because a lot of those politicians, they are also watching TV, they're listening, their kids are tuned in, and if we can change culture, we can change the political environment, and we can change the economic environment. Because these three areas are where social change happens. And we already know that the political sector is the last thing to change. And you know why it's the last thing to change? Because it is the place where white men overwhelmingly have power over laws. Up in the judicial system, in Congress, right? There's a lot of power there. And a lot of those people, they're not down with culture change. They're not getting down with the new culture. They are attached to a very old culture, old way of thinking, which includes, hey, it's okay to drill if that's what we need to get our energy from. They're not about the clean energy. I mean, we saw it. There's people even who we think are our allies that refuse to vote on clean energy. So we can't just concentrate on this. We have to concentrate on this because a lot of those young folks who maybe not be able to vote right now, they're going to be reading your zines, listening to music, watching TV, engaging in culture, and that's how we're going to reach people. It's a very, very powerful thing. And so I want to encourage all of you. I know there's a lot of artists in this room. Raise your hand if you have a creative practice, right? What kind of art do you all do? Just say it out loud. Crochet. Music. Apparel design. Pottery. Drawing. Woodwork. Climbing. What? Dancing. Okay. Y'all, we need this because imagine like if at concerts or at music events, we are talking about climate all the time. We're singing songs about getting the polluters out, right? We're singing songs about reconnecting with nature, actually caring about all our beautiful natural relatives, right? We need to challenge this colonial thinking, which literally has separated us from nature so that we can dominate nature. And I love what was said at the beginning, moving away from domination towards partnership. That's really what it is. And it's not just in relation to the natural world, it's in relation to each other, right? How do we collaborate with each other, love up on each other, lift each other up, really also recognize that we are highly, highly interconnected. It's going to happen when we think about culture. Because again, culture moves faster than politics, and culture shapes policy. In reality, policy is the manifestation of an idea whose time has come. But we create those ideas in culture, okay? And we need y'all stories. We need people to be brave. You know, I'm from the Bay Area. Colin Kaepernick, the first one to take a knee, right? When Colin Kaepernick took a knee, there was not a lot of sports people saying things about Black Lives Matter. And here we are a few years later, the WNBA, the soccer teams, I mean, everyone, all these athletes are all of a sudden making political statements. It started with one person, right? And he got inspired by another person. Remember 1968, the athlete who put his fist up during the Olympics. We need people to take bold actions so that we can create a cultural movement for the climate. Because artists, we actually shape what we see through our experience. So I don't know if y'all know this, but in Hollywood, right, Hollywood, did you guys know that of all scripted TV and film, and I'm talking about scripted, I'm not talking about documentary, I'm talking about fiction, right? Fiction. Out of all the TV shows and films in the last 4 years, only 2.8% talk about climate. So this is why we have a problem, because people are getting entertained and they have no idea that a climate crisis is happening. Even though it's happening outside of their windows, they are not seeing it in popular culture. So a lot of the work I do is how do we change that? I go to talk to TV writers, I go to talk to entertainment people and say if Hollywood is about showing the stories of today, the stories have to include climate. And so I want you to think about when you are talking about your experience, right? How you see the world, we need to be seeing it through more different people's glasses. We need to experience it in that way, because when we do that, when we put ourselves literally in the shoes of someone else, is when we can understand the power of what we need to do. And I'm going to give you a really useful thing to remember the power of stories. Okay, the power of stories is that a story is like a star. It shines bright. Okay, so stories create more stories. Stories open the door for other stories, right? And so, for example, the story of Trayvon Martin, right? Trayvon Martin was not the only young black person killed by the police, but his story killed by somebody who was violating some of these pro-gun laws, right? But his story propelled and it inspired a whole movement, Black Lives Matter. And then you had more stories, Sandra Bland, Mike Davis, right? And then we realized, oh, these stories are connected. This is not just one example of police misconduct. There's a lot of examples. And so when the stories become connected, they become constellations. And when you see a constellation, you can't unsee that. It becomes part of the zeitgeist. And this is actually what's happening right now in the climate movement. We have young people from all over the world, folks like Shia Bastida, Vanessa Nakate, Green Girl Leah, folks on social media who are saying, no, we do not buy, we're not here to support your carbon offsets. We're here to talk about a real climate revolution. We're here to talk about your responsibility in not polluting our planet, right? And they're standing up to polluters. They are getting in the face of polluters and saying, stop lying, stop greenwashing. And they are creating a fight that's irresistible. When I was at the UN Climate Summit, you know how many fossil fuel companies are up in those talks? And you know what? Politics is failing. When it comes to global solutions, they're not getting nothing done. They are actually being infiltrated by the fossil fuel companies, which is extremely upsetting. But then you have folks like Vanessa Nakate from Africa. You have Helena Gualinga from the Amazon who are getting up there and telling the truth. And even though politics isn't moving, they are shifting culture. Okay, so I want to just stress, we can't define our wins by just politics. We have to understand, we have to change the culture first, because most people don't understand how bad it is. And most people don't realize that it's not going to just be about recycling or going vegan. It's that we have to stand up against the 100 companies that are creating over 70% of emissions. This is a systemic issue. And they're only going to know when we make it cool, okay? Because y'all know the science isn't moving people. Data isn't moving people. But having a cool song or a dance or something that just makes it irresistible, that's what we have to go for. And so I want to encourage you all to really, really bring those skills. Okay, I'm going to start wrapping up because I know we're at time. So remember, stories change people, and people change systems. And we need to build a cultural infrastructure for our climate movement. We need all the dancers, we need musicians, folks like Lizzo to be, I am down with the climate movement, what do I need to do? And finally, I want to just close it out by, I'm going to show you some of my art, but I want you to remember something because we're all nature nerds here. You know, monoculture is what is killing our planet. Right? Monoculture. You talked about Idaho. Monoculture is what dominates. This is destroying the planet. This is not pretty. This is not cute. This is actually white supremacy right here, right? Dominant culture, monoculture, this is all you see. This is what television is like. Most of the time, you're just watching one person's experience, mostly white men's experience. We know this is not good for the planet. This is what's good for the planet, biodiversity. Okay, we are a biodiverse people. We need biodiverse stories. Just like biodiversity is what heals the planet, our cultural diversity is what we need. Okay, our practices, our language, our customs. So I want you to remember there is room. We are like nature. There is room for all of our stories. The more stories, the better. We can fight white supremacy by embracing biodiverse culture within ourselves and really using that as stories, right? And fighting the dominant culture. And so finally, I want to close out sharing with you some of my art. So I knew I wanted to be an artist since I was a kid. My parents, both immigrants, they were like, no, you got to do math, science, you got to be a lawyer. None of us went to college. You're our first college baby. And I had to listen to them. You know, my parents were just hella strict. But finally, when I got to college, y'all, I was like, deuces, I'm going to be an artist. And I started my own business. I actually ended up dropping out of school to pursue art because I couldn't get into any art schools because they would look at my political art and like, what's this? This is not a landscape. And I never got accepted to an art school. So I made my own path and I taught myself how to be an artist. I've been doing art for 20 years and it is the most powerful thing I can do because it is through the art that I'm able to express my love and solidarity with Mother Earth and to fight for Mother Earth and to really fight for us. You know, I love this quote. We are not protecting nature. We are nature protecting itself. Okay, and so let's use all our creative tools. You know, these posters I made, Green Art Communities, Love Your Mama. You know, these are basic things that we have to just remind people of and use our art, our creativity, everything we have for this movement. And I also want to say, you know, I'm an intersectional artist. Climate is one of my biggest things, but in reality, it is all connected, y'all. The fact that we don't have comprehensive gun policy is related to the climate crisis. It is the same polluters who are fighting against our bodily autonomy and who are fighting against guns and who are fighting to keep us poor. Bye-bye binary, okay? Bye-bye binary. The binary is not biodiverse. The binary is monoculture. So let's also remember that in this movement, we need more femme voices. We need trans voices. We need queer voices. We need to break with all of these old colonial ways and really embrace the diversity, the complexity that nature teaches us. Nature, there's no bosses in nature. There's no borders in nature. Nature is not enforcing a gender thing. Right? And so when we're able to tell these stories, like connecting, this is a piece I did around connecting migration to the natural world. Butterflies don't have to carry a passport. They don't need no green card, right? Nature has no borders. Why have we created a system that keeps people in and out while our planet is on fire? So let's reimagine, y'all. Art allows us to imagine that which might seem impossible, but art lets us. It makes it tangible. It makes the impossible feel tangible. So thank you so much for your attention, y'all, today. I'm excited to lead an art workshop with you later today. And thank you all for your work and for being here.